Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Honorable Vice Chancellor, Dr. Bushra Yasmeen, my dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a wonderful opportunity to be here at the second international conference which has been organized by the Fatima Jinnah Women's University, a university which has established a very strong reputation for itself and is noted for its extremely capable faculty and a very, very modern and organized curriculum. Ladies and gentlemen, the issue that is being presented by various speakers and distinguished experts in this conference, which is spread over actually from the 3rd to the 6th of October, is the fundamental issues related to sustainable development in the contemporary world. Ladies and gentlemen, the way I see it, and this is also implicit in the design of the sessions of this conference, that there are essentially 3 levels of sustainability. In a sense, they can be distinguished in terms of the time horizon. One is the short-run sustainable issue, particularly related to financial sustainability. The second issue is, of course, what we are all increasingly focusing on, which is environmental sustainability, particularly related to the climate change impacts. And we've already seen some of the terrible and disastrous implications for us in Pakistan due to the floods. And the third and more long-term sustainable development is the focus provided by the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, which have a series of goals and targets and indicators and is targeted for achievement by 2030. And in particular focuses on SDG targets for poverty reduction, for unemployment reduction, for youth, for gender, so on and so forth. So there are these 3 very, very important aspects of sustainable development, which this conference is focusing on. An extremely well-designed set of sessions have been put together, and we all look forward to hearing the speakers subsequently. I will today focus on the short-run issues of financial sustainability. And this has acquired a great importance in the global context today after the implications of the Russia-Ukraine war, the disturbance that took place in global supply chains, and the extraordinary exponential increase in commodity prices that we have seen since 21 and now in 22. And this has had all kinds of implications on the current account deficits and balance of payments position of a large number of countries, including Pakistan. And in fact, now we are moving to the other extreme, which is a deep recession with high interest rates, and the global capital markets are becoming tighter and tighter. Perhaps what is very significant is that for many countries, default has come into the horizon as a possible development. And Pakistan itself also finds itself somewhat placed in this position in the not so distant future. A very significant sovereign debt vulnerability ranking has been produced recently by Investors Education, and they have identified as many as 25 countries in the world which are vulnerable to default. And I'm afraid Pakistan has also been included in this list. And in the ranking, perhaps rather surprisingly, as I will show later on, Pakistan is placed as high as 4th in this list. Needless to say, Sri Lanka has already defaulted in our region. Now, the point is that the simultaneously for Pakistan, what has been a somewhat worrying development is that some time ago, prior to the recommencement of the IMF program in September, many credit rating agencies, including the big ones like S&P, Fitch, and Moody's, all downgraded Pakistan to a B- rating and transformed us from stable to negative. This is at the if you like, at the line where countries can begin to be seen as perhaps prone to default. So we have today a B- negative rating. The restoration of the IMF program has unfortunately not yet led to an improvement in the credit rating. We would like to hope that this will happen, but perhaps this has been delayed by the fact that even after the return of the IMF program for one more year, Pakistan's foreign exchange reserves have fallen to extremely worrying low level. Prior to the return of the IMF, our reserves were 9.8. Then we got this $1.2 billion from the IMF, but since then, our reserves have continued to fall. And as of the end of September, we are down to close to $8 billion. This is adequate only to provide import cover for 1.2, 1.3 months. For any country, the safe level of import cover, as you know, is at least 3 months of imports. So we really do not, at this point, have a safe import cover. The other indication of the greater international perception of risk of Pakistan is the fact that Pakistani bonds, the euro and the sukuk bonds, today carry a much heavier discount than was the case ever before. And this will make it increasingly difficult to float bonds in weeks and months to come. Let me just highlight what the implications of moving closer or perhaps even defaulting are for any country, with 25 countries in the world vulnerable. Believe it or not, this is perhaps the highest incidence ever of the likelihood of default globally. 1/6 of the world's population is in countries which are considered today as vulnerable to default, includes large countries like Brazil, Pakistan, Egypt, Argentina, and so on and so forth. We have seen the experience of countries which have actually experienced default, unfortunately. Sri Lanka is our closest country. The rate of inflation in Sri Lanka has approached over 60%. And the GDP growth rate has, of course, turned negative because of the shortage of imports and essential supplies. So God forbid, we have to be very, very careful about ensuring that such a situation does not arise in our country. Why has Pakistan been included in this list of countries considered as vulnerable to default? This is a very important question. Today, Pakistan's total external debt, both to the public and private sectors, adds up to $130 billion as of the end of 2021-22. This is equivalent to 40% of the recently rebased GDP. Prior to this rebasing, it was actually significantly higher because the GDP has been raised through rebasing by about 16%. Prior to the rebasing, the ratio was close to 46%. Now, of course, if you look at the other countries, Pakistan appears to be relatively better placed in terms of the burden of external debt. Our ratio is 40, as I just said, 40%. Brazil, as high as 80%. Sri Lanka, 71%. Argentina, 67%, and Turkey, which is considered as a marginally in default, 61%. So fortunately, in this indicator, Pakistan appears to be in a significantly better position. But then the other measure which is used to evaluate vulnerability is the ratio of foreign exchange reserves to the external debt. Here, I'm afraid we do not do too well. Currently with reserves at close to $8 billion, with debt close to $130 billion, we are actually below 7%, whereas other countries like Argentina are at 9%, Brazil at 24%, Turkey at 18%. Of course, Sri Lanka is very low at only 3%. But in this particular indicator, Pakistan seems to be a relatively perilous and difficult position. The problem with our country has been that external debt has doubled in only 7 years after 2014-15. And this is, of course, primarily because we have been carrying periodically in different years, like 2017-18, last year, and so on, extremely high current account deficits which have to be financed. And when you finance them, you borrow more, and when you borrow more, your debt goes up. Believe it or not, over the last 7 years, our total current account deficit cumulatively is $75 billion. And if you take this on an annual average as a percentage of the GDP, it's anywhere between 3.2 to 3.6% of the GDP, which is high in Pakistan's case by historical standards. Of course, it reached a peak of 6.4% in 2017-18, and last year hit a $17 billion of current account deficit, and with the ratio at 4.6% of the GDP. So whenever the current deficit rises disproportionately, inevitably the country has to borrow because you do not have reserves adequate to finance it. And the end result is that the external debt goes up, and subsequently your external financing requirements go up further because of the rise in the external debt repayment liabilities. So today the position for Pakistan is that in 2014-15, Pakistan's external debt to GDP ratio was only 24%. And in the period of 7 years, it has gone up to 40, in fact, would have been 46% if we had taken the original GDP estimates. Interestingly, at that time in 2014-15, we were not very far from the safe level of this ratio, which you see in countries like India and perhaps Bangladesh, although Bangladesh is also beginning to get worried and has sought an IMF program. India's GDP ratio is, I'm sorry. India's ratio is also close to 20%. Now, the problem has been compounded further by the fact that the doubling of the external debt in the last 7 years has been accompanied by actual tripling of the external debt repayment liability annually. And it has gone up from $4 billion in 2014-15 to $12 billion currently. Why has this happened? This is the consequence of a change fundamentally in the composition of the external debt of Pakistan. Historically, Pakistan was a country which essentially went to multilateral agencies like the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, so on, who provided project and program assistance on a long-term basis, essentially with concessional interest rates. Increasingly, when our current account deficits reach particularly high levels, like in 2017-18, We had to go and find lenders in the commercial banks internationally, particularly Chinese and other banks like Standard Bank and so on, and also float bonds. Both these are relatively high cost and have a medium-term tenure. And that explains why our external debt servicing or debt repayment liability has gone up 3 times in 7 years. And today, the share of medium-term and relatively short-term debt share has gone up from 24% in 2014-15 to almost 43% in 21-22. Ladies and gentlemen, we see a very clear pattern. Whenever Pakistan has had to finance a large current deficit, account deficit, like in 2017-18, we had a deficit of $19.3 billion, perhaps the highest in our history. And as a result of which, the net increase in our external debt due to higher borrowing was as much as $11.8 billion. But that still left a gap of $7.5 billion, and that was inevitably reflected in a quantum decline in our foreign exchange reserves. We have seen a similar thing happen last year. Our current account deficit rose once again because of this commodity price boom following the war between Russia and Ukraine. It jumped up again to a very high level of $17.3 billion, and we were able to only organize external debt plus net in foreign investment of close to $10 billion. And the end result was that our reserves plummeted by something like $7 billion and stood at $9.8 billion at the start of the current financial year. So when the current deficit is large, there is a resort to more external borrowing. And when we resort to more external borrowing, as I've said earlier, downstream, it creates further external debt repayment liabilities. Now let us look at the projections made by the IMF in its recent staff report following the approval by the executive board of the 7th and 8th reviews of Pakistan and the release of $1.2 billion. One of the most important parts of the staff report relates to an estimation of the external financing requirements and the source of financing of this debt creation. We see now that the external financing requirements for Pakistan that have been projected, and I'm giving you the numbers on a net basis and not on a gross basis, because the gross basis includes the liability which otherwise would result due to rollover of debt. I'm taking the net figures based on assumptions about the extent of rollover, particularly of short-term debt. The requirement, according to the IMF in 2022-23, they have assumed that the Pakistan's current account deficit would be halved almost from $17.4 billion last year to $9.3 billion this year, which alone requires an extraordinary effort at trying to stabilize the economy through very contractionary fiscal, monetary, and trade policies. And the external debt payment included leads to a net requirement of close to $18 billion. The financing that is being put together, according to the IMF, which we can probably begin to avail in the presence of the IMF program, is in the region of about $21 billion. That means we could have, in that sense, extra $3 billion or so to support the augmentation of our foreign exchange reserves, which are at a very low level. Then comes the IMF's extra funding to Pakistan, which is estimated at about $3.6 billion if we successfully complete the 9th, the 10th, and the 11th review by May 2023, then Pakistan would receive an additional $3.6 billion. So combined together, these two, Pakistan would be in a position to build its reserves by an extra over $6 billion. And mashallah, we can take our reserves up to close to $16 billion, which is about 2.5 months reserve cover. So the IMF scenario is a positive one. Of course, it is based on assumptions that Pakistan implements all the reforms agreed to. Pakistan meets the performance criteria and indicative targets and the structural benchmarks and is able to proceed systematically and consistently with the targets in the IMF program. And if all this happens, then inshallah, Pakistan by June 2023 would be back again in a position of relatively healthy foreign exchange reserves of $16 billion, close to 2.5 months reserve cover. I'm afraid I've had to develop a somewhat alternative current scenario for this year, 2022-23, which takes account some new factors which have entered the scene. The first is the negative impact of the floods. The floods are now going to create a situation where, very unfortunately, Pakistan's exports could be affected adversely, particularly of textiles and rice. And on the other hand, our imports would have to go up because of the damage to the cotton crop. We would have to import larger quantities of cotton, and possibly, given the next Rabi crop's difficulty in sowing, we may have to import more wheat during the year. And as a result of all this, I have assumed that even after contractionary fiscal monetary policies, we would still probably have now a current account deficit, which is about $3 billion higher than anticipated by the IMF. The second point I'd like to make is that IMF thinks that Pakistan, under the umbrella of the IMF program, could seek substantially larger financing from private creditors. The private creditors are, of course, the flotation of bonds and, of course, the borrowing from international commercial banks, particularly Chinese banks. In fact, the IMF assumes that this could more or less double this year in relation to last year, where the need still was high. I am being somewhat more conservative on that front because risk perceptions about Pakistan have gone up. And as I said earlier, flotation of bonds would be especially difficult given the large discounts we are currently facing. I am, however, assuming that official creditors, the World Bank, the Asian Bank, and others, and particularly some bilaterals, including possibly the Paris Club, and of course, needless to say, others, who I will mention shortly, would come through with larger support to Pakistan, particularly for rehabilitation and reconstruction financing after the floods. And therefore, we have assumed here that about $3 billion extra would be forthcoming, partly by switching from regular lines of finance. Overall, my assessment is that the financing gap, if we have a current account deficit of $12 billion, would be in the region of about $3 billion. And if the IMF program continues and we meet the targets and get whatever waivers are necessary, and we are successful in renegotiating the targets and bringing them down to more realistic levels and somewhat softening the reform agenda after the floods, and Pakistan is able to implement successfully over the next 3 reviews, then the $3.6 billion means that Pakistan would end up with a small surplus of $0.6 billion, And realistically speaking, our reserves could cross $10 billion by the end of next year. But this is based on some very fine assumptions and some of the risk elements I need to highlight. The big question mark to me is one of the largest bilateral sources of support to Pakistan, and I thank China for the extraordinary bilateral support they have given us, not only in terms of CPEC-related projects, but also in terms of large investments in the power sector. And the Chinese international commercial banks have been a significant and large source of funding for Pakistan. The fundamental question is, will China also be willing on a more expanded scale beyond swap funds and so on to give us debt rescheduling and debt relief? This is perhaps the single most important question, because that will also guide and influence the behavior of other bilaterals globally. So we are waiting to see after the Prime Minister's visit, which is expected to be in November, to China to see what happens. And as always, let me also tell you that when I was in the hot seat after the bomb in 1998, one of the countries which came to our support fairly quickly was China. And I want to place on record my deep appreciation of the support from China, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and so on at that very difficult time in Pakistan's history. Ladies and gentlemen, the financing needs of Pakistan, unfortunately, will continue to grow, particularly because as we borrow more, our external debt repayment liabilities keep on increasing. As I've said, they've already tripled in the last 7 years. Hopefully, they will not rise as fast, but they will certainly continue to grow. And the IMF's estimates are that there will be an increase each year in 2023, 24, and 24-25 by about $3 billion extra annually in terms of our external financing requirements. Does this mean Pakistan will need to negotiate a 3-year extended fund facility again with the IMF after May 23, when the program, the present one, comes to an end? Ladies and gentlemen, I will quickly and very importantly take you through the top priority policies we need to implement to ensure that our current account deficit remains under control and does not start going out of control as happened last year and sometimes in the past. The key thing is we have to have more export-led growth. Unfortunately, what has been happening is that systematically over the last 5-6 years, the incentives that we have traditionally given to our exporters have generally been gradually withdrawn. The first withdrawal was the zero rating of export sectors. Now domestic sales of export industries have been subjected to full taxation, and we are collecting as much as 50 to 60 billion rupees from the export sector in sales revenue, tax revenue. This is something which was there till the budget of 2019-20. This is unfortunate. The second thing which happened is that a few weeks ago, under IMF pressure, the subsidized refinancing of exports was withdrawn. That used to create a differential of as much as perhaps 5 or more percentage points and certainly facilitate liquidity of exporters. And the third, of course, was that Pakistan had maintained a policy of a lower electricity tariff of 9 cents per kilowatt hour for export-oriented industry. This has again been brought into doubt, and NEPRA is currently wavering as to whether it will recommend this or not. So the 3 main instruments of incentivization of the export sector are in jeopardy. 2 have already gone, and 1 is in jeopardy. So the result is export profitability is increasingly suspect. And when you allow for the fact that Pakistan could see quantum increases in gas prices, in electricity tariffs, and of course, we have already seen the quantum jump in transport costs, we are beginning to see substantial cost push inflation, which will be reflected in the loss of competitiveness of our exports at a time when the global environment is getting increasingly tighter due to the looming global recession. So my plea is we should try and convince the policy makers as well as the fund that Pakistan has to increase profitability of exporters. Exchange rate beyond a point doesn't help because the textile sector in particular is dependent on a large amount of foreign inputs, like, of course, machinery, like art silk and rayon, and now, of course, cotton. So if you use the exchange rate, half almost of that effect is lost due to higher cost of inputs. So we have to find a different way of promoting profitability in the export sector. The second is the strong deterrence of imports. Last year, imports broke an all-time record and reached, believe it or not, the level of 21% of GDP. I remember in our time when we used to be in government over 2 decades ago, it used to be about 11 to 12% of GDP. Imports have had an unbelievable exponential growth in Pakistan, particularly in years when we kept the real effective exchange rate very high, like in the middle part of the last decade. The end result is that our imports have grown outrageously. And one of the big reasons for that extraordinary growth also has been the fact that Pakistan has perhaps over-liberalized its import regime. And what do we mean by that? There was a time in the mid-90s when we were helping in the government policy making, both internally and externally. Pakistan's average incidence of import duty on the value of imports used to be 21%. Today, it is down to 7%. The other, perhaps something which very few people have realized, is that we have over-liberalized more than India and Bangladesh, both of whom have a substantially larger export base. What is the evidence for this? According to the world tariff profiles of the WTO, the average MFN tariff in Pakistan is 11%. It is 14% in Bangladesh, and believe it or not, 18% in India. And what is even more striking is that India has given enormously higher protection to agricultural sector. There were years when India was not surplus yet in cotton. The import duty on cotton used to be anywhere like 40 to 50% by India. Believe it or not, you will be surprised perhaps to know that the import duty on cotton in Pakistan today is 0%. No protection whatsoever to a cotton grower. No wonder we have seen an unfortunate switch in cropping patterns away from cotton to sugarcane and other products. We have to bring that back. My recommendation is that there has to be a system-wide escalation in import tariffs to provide more protection and to encourage what we call made in Pakistan. Made in Pakistan. So I'm recommending the following. Generalized import reform. We have currently 4 slabs, 3, 11, 16, and 20. We move to 5, 15, 25, and 35. And we add an import handling charge of 1 to 2%. This should help us. And finally, my recommendation would be that at this time when global interest rates are going up, the time has come to raise the return further on Russian digital accounts and on foreign currency accounts by up to 2 percentage points. This is necessary if the money is to stay with Pakistan. Ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude by saying that we all are worried. This is our beloved country. We do not want to even consider for a moment the possibility of difficulty or inability to honor our external payment obligations. We owe it to our political and leadership and institutional capacity that we have to ensure that whatever may happen, Pakistan emerges in the next few years as a country which has not only been able to successfully avoid its default, but inshallah, I pray will show sustainable growth and inclusive development once again. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your hearing my plea. Thank you.